Thank you. So by way of background, I do teach at Ontario Tech University right now in the Toronto area. But before that, I was always involved in intelligence history, doing that throughout my career, and then working for Canadian intelligence, dealing with the PRC, specifically on foreign interference and influence. So in some senses, this was a very easy book for me to write, and a very challenging one at the same time, because I had to separate in my mind what I know from some fields and what I knew from others. But nonetheless, it's also a bit of a problem, I think, that it was so easy to write. So I want to start actually with a little exercise in visualization, and imagine a neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, you have a very secure, well-built house. You've done everything responsible, or at least it feels like it. As a homeowner, you've locked your front door, you've installed a state-of-the-art alarm system, reinforced the windows. You feel generally safe, and you trust those walls. It's not to say there's no problems with your security, and there's not maybe missteps in judgment, but for the most part, you feel generally secure. But you look out your window and you see smoke, and that smoke is rising from the house next door, because the neighbor's house is the one that's on fire. Now, your first instinct maybe is sympathy. It's terrible for them. Second, more pragmatic thought might cross your mind. At least it's not my house, right? Everything's secure over here. I'm relatively safe. But anyone who knows fire in the most basic sense knows that it's a dangerous illusion, because a little bit of wind blows the wrong way, the embers travel, structures are connected, houses, heat transfers through those walls. You find the cracks are found, and it jumps the fence. For the United States, Canada is that neighbor. And for the last 50 years, in some senses, the country has been burning quietly, smoldering outside of sight. I spent my career, as I mentioned, studying security, counterintelligence, foreign interference, and I wrote the book because I thought the story of Canada's relationship with the People's Republic of China is not just a Canadian story. For decades, the Communist Party of China, the CCP, has perceived Canada not just in friendly ways or as a trading partner, as is popular in the news today, but as a staging ground, viewing it as a base of operations for spying on, for penetrating, pressuring a bigger target, that being the United States. So I look around the room, I see a diverse group, I see generally Americans who maybe are concerned about their national security, Canada's national security. Maybe some are dissidents, activists, survivors. So I'm here to tell you, and my American friends here, that the border doesn't necessarily stop that threat. What happens in Vancouver or what happens in Toronto echoes in Seattle and it echoes in Washington. And there's a lot of crossover between the methodology and the tactics that I discuss in this book that also occurs in the United States. Why? Because it's been happening in a number of countries, be it Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom. And so the playbook doesn't differ all that much, even though the characters might. And for some of you, I know this is not an academic lecture, this is lived reality. That the long arm of Beijing does not stop or respect a border. Some have lived with harassment, fear, and silence. So we'll try to tonight speak and break that silence. So I'm going to talk about foreign malign influence, or foreign interference as it's known in Canada. It takes on different names depending on where we are. But we'll look at how the PRC operates differently than other adversaries that the West has faced previously in the past. And we'll look at some of the specific machinery that's in use and in play, particularly in regards to the United Front. And we'll look at how open societies then can be weaponized for its purposes. So before we even get into the history, though, we also have to kind of set the terms or the boundaries, I guess, on what it is we're actually talking about, because the words really matter. When people hear the phrase foreign interference or foreign malign influence, maybe, I don't know, the thought goes to movies or TV. Some people have conceptions of spy films or television, or perhaps more modern context, things like Russian bots on Facebook trying to swing an election. But what we're dealing with is far more complex and nuanced. So in the United States here, you use the term foreign malign influence. And the government defines this actually really clearly in law. It's defined as any hostile effort undertaken by or at the direction of a foreign country, and with the objective of influencing your policies, your elections, or your public opinion. Now, I've been asked by students, isn't that just the same as spying? Didn't the Russians do the same thing during the Cold War? Yes and no. So what's the difference? The Soviet Union engaged in disinformation, yes. They were actually really, you could say, the masters of it. They created front organizations. They tried to engage in attempts to manipulate. They created nonprofit organizations to push policy internationally that would benefit the Soviet Union. They tried to lure dissidents back to the Soviet Union, very elaborate schemes, some of which were very successful in history. And they hunted their opposition internationally, most famously Leon Trotsky. But they engaged in that, trying to even assassinate Ukrainian nationalists. It's not an unfamiliar tactic, but what's the fundamental difference? And the difference is the environments, meaning the Soviet Union was a closed system for the most part. Their communist state-centered society was largely cut off from the West. They were worried about their own people defecting if they left. You would never have seen the Soviet Union investing in Georgetown University. That wouldn't have happened. You wouldn't see the KGB essentially buying up maybe a local newspaper in Iowa. You wouldn't see a Soviet state-owned enterprise trying to buy a controlling stake in a Western technology firm. Those things didn't happen. They were outside trying to get in, find ways in. Things are different with the People's Republic of China because the PRC is already inside. After President Nixon's historic visit in 1972, especially after China opened up its economy in the late 1970s, the West made a largely collective decision there. They essentially welcomed investment, granted normal trading status to the PRC, welcomed students. And I would say collectively we tended to view this era of the late 70s into the 1980s really with a type of rose-colored glasses. If we just traded enough, if we just engaged enough, China would become more like us. Economic liberalization would inevitably lead to political. Tiananmen Square changed that assessment, but only briefly, as shocking as that may sound. Because once we entered into the 90s, both the United States and Canada had a popular term amongst the kids these days is FOMO, fear of missing out, and wanted to get back to the quote-unquote way things were. Because while we were opening the doors in this aspect, the CCP was building strategy to exploit that openness. And so the avenues and the vectors for malign influence today are really numerous, widespread, and systematic. How did that happen? I would say we look to Canada first, because prior to Nixon's visit, prior to the recognition of China by the United States, the PRC, I should say. In 1970, under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Canada did recognize the PRC. We were one of the first nations to do so. Others obviously preceded us. France did, so did the United Kingdom. But something very different, something that became known as the Canadian formula, was developed at that time. And the core issue there was Taiwan, because the PRC had demanded at that period that a recognition of the PRC, China, come with recognizing one China, meaning the PRC. Taiwan was to be regarded as a breakaway province. And so Canada tried to walk a tightrope in this moment. Recognize the PRC as the sole legal government of China and took note over the claim of Taiwan. That may sound like boring diplomatic language, but this was a massive victory for Beijing because it effectively isolated Taiwan internationally. And soon after, the United States adopted a nearly identical position, complete with almost identical language in its recognition. Why is that significant? Because what also was occurring that you'll see in the book is Canada had this idea that it would chart a more independent foreign policy of the United States. It would do this first. There was a bit of a need for that recognition. If you're Canadian, you'll understand that there's a lot of people that need that or feel they need that recognition from the United States. There's always that lingering one eye on whatever the Americans are doing. And in this period, what has now become clear is one really influential figure in that time period was an individual named Paul Lin. And Lin actually went on to help create the Canada-China Business Council, which still exists today. And what I came to discover from declassified documents that I was able to get through a Freedom of Information request was that he was an agent of influence working for the CCP. He was influential in promoting recognition of China. He was being consulted by government. There were documents that showed that he may have actually been secretly meeting back and forth with PRC officials and with Canadian leaders. He formed a relationship afterwards with the government and became known by Pierre Trudeau. And he goes on to the United States after, which the RCMP's security services estimated that that was his next big target, was to promote the recognition of the PRC within the United States. So what does that mean? That means that there was likely then PRC foreign influence happening from the very beginning when Canada recognized the PRC. That carries then implications for the United States in its recognition, and that carries with us to the present. So from that moment on, the CCP really comes to view Canada as a strategic entry point. After the recognition, when Mao learned that the recognition was successful, he had said, and I quoted in the book, he laughed first and said that now we have a friend in America's backyard. So Canada was seen essentially as safe harbor, so to speak. And so compared to the US, there were lower security barriers. It's a very open society, but there's also technological value. Canada is still one of the members of the G7. It's a part of NATO. It's part of an integrated defense alliance with the United States for the continent. And there's a trusting integration with the US. But they understood a relatively simple truth. If you want to steal secrets from the United States or influence it, you don't always have to break into the Pentagon. Sometimes maybe even Vancouver would do. So I'll get into the strategy now. And it really centers around the idea of the United Front. This won't be unfamiliar for some of you, because it's not a new concept. It's been written about before, and it's happened in, as I mentioned, across the Western world. But it actually, again, derives from the Soviet Union. The credit for the United Front does not necessarily belong to the PRC. It belongs to Vladimir Lenin. Because Lenin had written that a powerful enemy could only be defeated by exerting the utmost effort to use every rift that could appear among them. If you take advantage of even the smallest opportunity to gain a mass ally, even if that ally is temporary, vacillating, unstable, or even unreliable, temporary, vacillating, unstable. You don't need to be a true believer in the same ideology. You just have to be useful at a moment in time. And so in the US and Canada, that strategy then means finding allies who can influence decision making, who could control or even influencing messaging, who could promote propaganda and have it just appear innocuous. And that's the United Front Work Department's primary objectives, the UFWD. And again, it's important. I think there's a lot of authors that sometimes get this wrong. There's a big difference between the strategy, as I call it, United Front lowercase, and the organization, the UFWD. Because the strategy is enshrined in the PRC Constitution. It's integral to the party. The UFWD is the organization carrying it out, but they don't work alone in carrying out that strategy, hence the name. Who participates in it? Essentially, everyone can be called to participate in it. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, OCIO, China Federation of Returned Overseas Chinese. It's a whole of society approach that can be involved in the broad strokes general strategy. And the members, the people that are carrying that out, and even the UFWD itself, again, some people I think exaggerate this in referring to them as trained intelligence officers or gatherers in a more traditional sense. They are not. They operate out of embassies and consulates, yes. But the primary job is to cultivate relationships, so maybe that shares overlap. It's different, is the easiest way I can describe, from traditional intelligence collection work. They can guide community organizations, presenting their work as service to the motherland. They can look for rifts that Lenin talked about. They're not necessarily building, though, source networks like something like the MSS would do, or engaging the type of activities that the MSS would do. They're more about those cultivating relationships and friendships. It's not to say they don't have connections with intelligence or might work together on something, but it's just a different organization, a different way of, I guess you could say, doing business. They'll mobilize individuals, groups outside of China to support party objectives, promote positive narratives, suppressing dissent. And it's what makes that threat so difficult to counter. It doesn't look like an attack. It might, the community organization, business networking is what it could look like. It could look like academic exchange. But beneath the surface, the machinery of the state turns. Now, why did I say Vancouver before instead of getting to the Pentagon through Vancouver? So, because we'll talk about a case study really soon here. Well, let's move from theory to practice. How an example within Canada can serve as a staging ground for an attack on the United States. We often hear about cyber espionage, hacks, Salt Typhoon more recently in the news. But to make these things effective, oftentimes what makes them even more effective is when we have a human element that is part of that. I'm going to tell you the story of a man named Su Bin. And he was a Chinese businessman. He operated out of Canada. He was not a trained spy. He wasn't a hacker sitting in a dark room with a hoodie, as they are all now portrayed. Every needs a hoodie. He was an aviation entrepreneur. He acted like a legitimate businessman. But he's crucial in this story. Why? Because what he does is essentially he acts as a spotter for hackers that are actually based in China, working for the PLA. You think about the challenge that an individual hacker might face. Let's say you're successful and you breach the network of a big defense contractor, like Boeing or like Lockheed Martin. Well, what do you face if you're successful? Millions of files, so much data, and limited time to be operating within there before detection starts. It's like breaking into a library or JF Books and doing it in the dark, and you can't see, okay? You don't steal them because you don't know what's valuable. You're not sure so you don't know what to grab. Su Bin was the guy with the flashlight. He would identify the key engineers to target. He identified the data that's valuable. Because of his ability to operate in both Mandarin and English when it came to the aviation industry and engineering, he could easily translate and understand documents of value in both languages. So he targeted cutting-edge American military aircraft. The C-17 transport plane, the PRC, this is the transport plane that would transport the president's vehicles, often used to airlift in military vehicles in operations abroad. And the PRC always had a very difficult time constructing a similar aircraft to similar capabilities. So this was of real importance to them. But he also identified plans relating to the F-22 and even portions of the F-35 fighter jet. And so he helped the hackers pinpoint the most valuable secrets amongst thousands of stolen files. He would look at a file list and tell them this, take this, ignore this. And so this operation allowed Beijing to obtain research and development files worth tens of billions of dollars. Now you think about then, what is the impact economically for American taxpayers that paid for that research? American engineers that spent years of their lives developing it. The PRC gets it for a fraction of the cost, directly eroding technological advantage that the US possesses. The former director of the NSA had stated that the scale of cyber theft attributed to China constitutes, quote, the greatest transfer of wealth in human history, end quote. Where was Su Bin? The whole time he was in Canada. And the case highlights a critical point. The threat often comes from non-state actors. Su Bin was not directly he was working for the PRC state, but more tasked by it. He wasn't a direct government employee. He wasn't an intelligence officer. He was likely motivated by money, perhaps maybe patriotism to a degree, but he was used. He was an instrument of state power. One of the FBI agents that was involved in the case said something that was really quite alarming when he said, quote, I don't know how many Su Bins there are. And that's the reality that comes with something like the United Front. It really blurs the lines between private citizen and state agent. It turns regular business activities into vectors of espionage. It uses third-party groups to complicate attribution, which is central in a cyber operation. But you don't always have to steal. That's the other part. Sometimes we just willingly give stuff. And that brings us to economic security, academic partnerships. So for decades, Western universities in Canada and the United States have been eager for not necessarily students, not necessarily knowledge, but funding. And we believe in open science and that technology belongs to the world and collaboration is a good thing. The PRC also knows this, and they use that optimism So one prominent method was the Thousand Talents Plan, the TTP. Now they've changed the name since, but still more or less the same. On the surface, it looked like a standard academic exchange program. The PRC offers lucrative grants, positions to Western academics, and they rolled out the red carpet for you when you arrived. Used flattery, get you status. And for academics, it was easy money because you would get a short teaching stint in China for about 3 months, and that was your only obligation. You'd come back and you'd get like $250,000 for research money. No big deal, but there were strings attached. As one professor of Hong Kong descent had told me, who refused to sign on to the TTP, he learned early in life that nothing was free. A 2019 US Senate report revealed that participants had to sign contracts with secrecy clauses. And those contracts granted Chinese institutions the rights to the intellectual property that were developed by the researcher, even if that research was funded in the United States or other Western countries. And so it wasn't just about sharing knowledge then, it was a vacuum cleaner for IP in a way. It was about acquiring sensitive dual use technology. What's dual use technology? It's technology that can be used in both a civilian and a military application. And the PRC used it to assist with military modernization. Again, as I said, the program has now been rebranded. That seems to be one of the ways that the PRC tends to react to these things. They change the name, or the organization changes its name. It's still the same. Now it's the National High-End Foreign Experts Recruitment Plan. Thousand Talents became too notorious. They love these long names too, which I don't understand. But the goal remains the same: acquire foreign expertise to advance initiatives like the Made in China 2025 initiative. Then there is state-owned enterprises, another aspect to understanding how economic security becomes endangered. So in the West, you have a line that is drawn between private companies and the government. In China, that line is much more blurry. Some have called it CCP Incorporated. State-owned enterprises, essentially tools of the state. They could be used to acquire foreign companies, gain access to critical infrastructure, advance strategic goals. They have access to state funding and subsidies that allow them to undercut their competitors. And we see this with other private companies that are heavily state subsidized in order to make them essentially what are called national champions. You saw that with Huawei, who has received a lot of state subsidies. And they end up offering massive funding to universities and research institutes. And it's hard for a dean or a professor to say no when there's millions of dollars in research grants that you badly need. But you get to what's the true cost of the money. So I've covered things like the movement of IP and what have you, and directly those cyber attacks. What about democracy? In the book, I document how the CCP targets political elites in Canada. And the exact same tactics are applied in the United States and elsewhere through a concept called guanxi. Generally, loosely translated, means relationships networks. Important to stress that this is an old concept, and it's a system of reciprocal obligations that's a central part of village life and society. And in itself, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just how things sometimes got done in a village or community setting. But again, it's been weaponized. Because the dynamics of guanxi to conduct political interference are used by the PRC, blurring the lines between networking and corruption. What does that look like in practice? You try to build long-term relationships with politicians. And you don't ask for a favor on the first day. You wait. you build trust, you engage in bringing people over on trade missions and back and forth kind of relationship building. You could organize fundraisers, make yourself indispensable, essentially, in a way. Photo ops. It's another important thing here to consider. The photographs actually have a lot of different meanings that can be attached to them, particularly at events where you have official PRC presence, so be it the embassy or something. And this is what activists had shared with me, that in these types of settings, the photo op with a politician, for the people in attendance, is a method of demonstrating that A, because of the official state presence at the community organization, they endorse that organization. And two, because of the presence of the politician, people are to understand this is someone that's friendly with us. To the politician, it's a souvenir. It's a means of trying to get votes, not particularly aware of different levels of meaning that are employed here. And for the United Front strategy, it can function as a type of social currency, right? It can signal, we have access to this person. If you want something done, go through me, I'll go through them. And what it ends up doing is a form of legitimization for CCP proxies that function within communities. And those proxies can present themselves as representing the entire diaspora in an area, as I was told. And it makes it harder for people to discern who is and who is not representative. It's also a mistake for Western politicians to continually assume that a community just thinks as a whole and is homogenous and doesn't contain divisions and, it is not diverse in its views. Gossip, right? Shame, also employed as a means of keeping people in line. The politician can be branded as anti-Chinese or racist on WeChat. They can lose their seat, not because of policy, but because of coordinated influence operations. Then there's staffers, people who work for them. Activists have told me that the people that control the schedules can sometimes control the information flow. The staffer can direct you to the events you're supposed to go to, the ones you're supposed to avoid. And so what's the difference with all this between influence and lobbying? Well, lobbying's regulated. Lobbying's transparent. A foreign government trying to manipulate the democratic process or individuals from the inside is not lobbying. Now, one of the more darker parts of this lecture, what happens when you refuse to comply? Here we get transnational repression. When a government reaches across borders to silence or control its citizens or former citizens. Why? Why do it? And this confused a lot of people in the West. Why do they care? What does a superpower care about a student posting on X in Boston or a grandmother handing out flyers in Toronto? Authoritarian regimes inherently fear challenges to legitimacy. They view diaspora not as people who have left, but as potential centers of opposition. They know, historically, revolutions are funded and organized abroad. Sun Yat-sen organized from abroad. The CCP knows this better than anyone. And they target, initially at least, what they call the five poisons, right? Pro-democracy movements, supporters of Taiwan, Tibet, Uyghurs, Falun Gong practitioners. Why target them on another continent? Because the CCP views any independent identity, any loyalty that is not to the party, as a threat. And so in that sense, I can see them, the way I try to explain this, is they have a transnational conception of sovereignty, that they believe themselves the sovereign of an individual, regardless of where they are, regardless of the laws in place where they are living. How do they do this? With direct threats, call you, message you, threaten family back in China, surveillance, using digital tools, informants, co-option, taking over community groups, ensuring people don't speak out, using quote-unquote police stations. And we see this clearly in something called Operation Fox Hunt, launched in 2014, officially about catching economic fugitives. Sounds legitimate. Sounds like it's fighting corruption. In reality, it operates outside the law. They don't use extradition treaties, or they're not limited by them. They'll use quote-unquote irregular measures. They can kidnap people, they can lure them, they can force family members to record videos pleading with a target to return. The FBI has warned that fox hunt is used to suppress dissent on American soil, charging individuals who act illegally as PRC agents. But one of the most disturbing aspects that I touch on in the book is really what I'm calling an unholy alliance between the state and organized crime. Because we've seen evidence of the CCP working with transnational criminal gangs across the world, including in the United States. Why would you do this? One, it offers a form of plausible deniability. If a gangster beats up a dissident, it's hard to link it to Beijing. Local knowledge. The criminals know the streets. They know the community far better than diplomats who are moved around the world. They are generally also good at what they do. They are better than the foreign diplomats and officers in terms of intimidation and violence. They're effective at it. What do they get for this? Status, operating, freely in whatever illicit activities they're engaged in. It's an outsourcing you can think of repression. And it's a war that's waged against some of the most vulnerable groups in society, and a violation of not only sovereignty, but of human rights. So what does it mean then, now, for the United States? It means you can't ignore what's happening in your neighbor's house. Because Canada's vulnerabilities are also your vulnerabilities. We share communities, we share borders, we share defense command, we share economies. In Under Assault, I document 50 years of this activity. And the evidence is pretty clear. The secret war isn't so secret anymore. And we have to essentially stop viewing China through the way we want to believe it is, rather than the way it actually is. So we need transparency. We need to call out foreign agents, proxies who support them. Protect people, some people in this room. We need to protect dissidents, people who fled tyranny, who shouldn't have to find it on this side of the ocean. So we have to make sure that when they look out their window, they don't see smoke, they see a community that will actually stand with them and a government that will protect them. So the fire has been burning for essentially far too long, and it's time we grab the hose.
I've been under the impression, I just double checked and I realized I was wrong, that Canada does not have a foreign agents registry, although they're about to
any day now
in 2026, I believe, by the end of the year. But it sounds like from what you're saying, a lot of these people who are involved would not even have to be registered. A businessman, is not a foreign agent, although they're being used in that kind of capacity. Do you anticipate that once it is actually established, that it will lead to positive changes?
It's a good question. It's a big unknown right now, if I'm being truly honest. It's a big unknown in a few ways. It's a big unknown of actually when is it going to come into effect. So the backstory on this was Bill C-70, which led to the creation of the Foreign Agent Registry, was given royal assent in the summer of 2024. But as part of the legislation, you had a coming into force date, which is when the legislation is to come into effect. That was left up to the government, which is common in some bills if something has to be set up. But we are almost 20 months out and we have nothing. It worries me in terms of when is this actually going to materialize. The regulations that I've already read that have been made public also worry me. The minimum amount for not declaring that you work for a foreign government, as of the current numbers, is $50 penalty. I'm very concerned about how would this function. So the United States has more recently been using FARA, its registry, for these purposes, for going after PRC agents of influence and people working for a foreign state. That's more or less more recent, I'd say within the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years. But they use it in a way, one, it's very publicized when it's used. Two, it's very punitive. It's designed, the way it's structured is a person is, you see that there's an attempt to try to impose a cost for the activity. The problem with what I've read from the Canadian legislation to date is the way that it often reads to me is a little worrisome, because there's a lot of emphasis on assisting individuals to register. So my concern is, will this registry essentially function as a managing influence of governmentality, where it's managing activities that are illicit and nefarious, as opposed to imposing cost on those activities? That's a very different thing. To set up a government bureaucracy for the point of keeping something under control but still allowing the activity to continue, versus using it in a more deterrent-minded fashion to impose costs to try to prevent people from wanting to go down that road. So how this is going to shake out right now is anybody's guess. A lot of it, I think, is going to come down to the manner in which it's enforced. Is the emphasis going to be on deterrence and cost imposition, or is it going to be more heavily swayed to, well, you're having problems registering, well, the government will help you do that? I hope not, but we'll see.
At least from like a layperson's perspective, it seems like defending against this would take significant and probably coordinated, synchronized effort between law enforcement, intel, policymakers, and then also adding an international slant to all those things, which make it even more complicated. So do you have any large recommendations, and if so, like to which sectors do those apply between those entities?
One thing that is of crucial importance is education and transparency. So transparency by governments in terms of detailing more about what the PRC does and how it does it is one. Things have gotten better. They're better here than they are in Canada. When the DOJ releases information about arrests, for instance, it's very detailed. In Canada, you get almost nothing. So there's that issue. But education is another one. A lot of people don't understand influence. They just think of spying. Spying, that's the common thing within the masses, so to speak, is espionage, spying. They don't understand that the more pervasive, the more long-standing, and the more damaging threat is influence. Much more so than spying. Spying, you look the other way, I take your pen. It's much more of a problem if I sit down and chat with you for a little while and I actually convince you just to give it to me. That's much worse. And that spreads. And I can use that to target more and more people. And I can have you helping me do that. I mean, that's much more damaging long-term, society-wise, than just a theft, right? So having people understand that as well. And the other thing that people have to understand as well, I said along with education, is understanding, because it's very dangerous, the situation that can become when people don't understand it and they start labeling entire communities as working for China. That's also a problem. Oh, well, they're Chinese, so they must be spies. That's racist. And that is something the PRC will actively exploit if it has that opportunity. If you give them a reason to use something like that, they will run with it. So again, that ties into the education aspect. Depending on the country, you need actual enforcement. So Canada, the UK, more so. multilateral is also important that we're not getting enough of. So for instance, NATO was repurposed after 9/11 and also engaged in countering terrorism. Much different from its original purposes. Why not repurpose again to target things like influence, more malign foreign influence and foreign interference? Because it's not just China doing it. Russia's doing that as well. Does it different ways, different intents. Iran does it. Other countries do these things. So this is something that I think to stop effectively, you also need effective measures that can be coordinated between countries. Why not have coordinated expulsion of diplomats? Why not have coordinated sanctions against individuals if they meet the criteria for doing these types of activities? So I think that's one way you're actually going to get a real effect, is by actually having, I would say, a united front against a united front.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.